Give it another few seconds as people get into the room, and then we'll get started. Great. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 16th International Digital Curation Conference, IDCC 21. And if you're talking about us on social media, there's the tag to use. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Kevin Ashley, and I'm lucky enough to be the director of the DCC. I'm just going to spend a few minutes giving you a quick guide to how today is going to go, either for those of you who are new to IDCC or those of you who've been before, just to explain how things are going to be just a little bit different this year. And then introduce our keynote speaker. So I'm here, yes, to welcome you all, to give you some practical information about the event, explain who we are and why we do this, help set the tone for the rest of the day before introducing our keynote. So we're the Digital Curation Centre, and our mission is to increase the capability and capacity for research data reuse in organisations of all types. And to do that, we run training, shared services, we provide consultancy, we run events like this one, we produce guidance, help develop policy standards, and look a bit at the futures of this type of work. But this event, the International Digital Curation Conference, is about curating digital content, what to do, when to do it, how, where, who buy, and when should we not do things, given that we cannot save everything, we cannot curate everything, how to make those difficult choices. It's an opportunity to tell others what you do, what you plan to do, what works and what doesn't, to listen, to learn, to connect and collaborate. And our theme this year, data quality and data limitations, working towards equality through data curation, is certainly going to be touched on, I think, by our keynote and indeed for many of the other sessions throughout the day. So I'll say a little about the structure of this year's event. It's very different from previous years. It's usually a 4-day event with 2 days of a conference and workshops, sandwiching that on either sides. But this year, we've got a 1-day event. It's co-located with the 17th RDA plenary, which we're also hosting. We've got a joint unconference tomorrow afternoon with RDA, which you're all registered for, given that you're registered for this event. So today, we're going to have a keynote. We're going to have the usual mix of papers, lightning talks and posters, and also a sponsor booth. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And of course, we're online, which has some restrictions, but it also gives us some extra features as well. The ability to chat to each other during the call, the ability to use this platform to schedule meetings with people. The sessions will be recorded. They're going to be available online, both via this platform and later on by YouTube, and we'll give you more information about that later on. So whether you're a session chair, a speaker at the event, or an attendee, you should already have received some instructions on what to do, on how to use the platform, on what we're expecting from you. If you haven't, do get in contact with us via the help desk. There are training rooms available for you to test out screen sharing, things like that before your session. There's the image of the help desk. You should see that on the conference homepage. And in the case of difficulty, you should use that or use the chat box, the icon, which the little purple icon with the speech bubble there that you can see at the bottom of that slide. There are 2 types of sessions in this platform that we're using called Juno, the main stage, which we're in now, and breakout sessions. Most of the sessions we have today are breakout sessions. They function in a way that will be familiar to you if you're used to using platforms like Zoom. But this main stage session means that it's only going to be the speakers and chairs that are visible. You can use a Q&A function that's next to the chat at the side to ask questions, or indeed you can do so in the chat. If you do it in the Q&A, there's the ability for other people to vote your questions up. In breakouts, we suggest you keep your cameras and microphone off whilst others are presenting. That ensures that the recording in particular will capture their presentation in as full screen as possible. You can request meetings with each other. You can use your profile to show when you're available, whether you wish to be contacted. There's a lot more information about that in the FAQs. There's a quick screenshot so you can recognize that part of your profile when you get to it. And you can also meet with our sponsor, LiveNova. At the head of the conference homepage, you can see a supporters item, and that will take you to information about when they're presenting and also the booth where you can meet them. You can visit the posters at any time and you get to vote for the best posters. The voting will close today at 1400 UTC, that's 3 p.m. local time here in the UK, and we're presenting awards for that and best poster later on. We have a code of conduct. I hope you've all read it. Please do respect it. It's not very onerous, but it requires us to suggest that we all should behave well towards each other. And we've got a new prize this year for the most active delegate, which will offer free registration for next year's IDCC. If you see that little lightning bolt and the information up in the top right, that indicates how much engagement you've done so far. And as your score goes up, maybe you'll be in line for that prize. If you're attending the unconference, you can contribute ideas to that now via the Google Doc that's linked to from that page there. And to provide some entertainment in the lunch break today, we're going to be doing a short trivia quiz on IDCC. So that will take place at 1100 UTC, that's midday UK time. That's towards the end of today's lunch break. But now I want you all to listen, and after listening, to talk, to interact, to be inspired to do something. I'm pleased now to introduce our keynote speaker, Taka Keegan. He's the Associate Professor in Computing and Associate Dean Mãori for the Division of Health, Engineering, Computing and Science at the University of Waikato. So I'm now going to cease showing my screen. Taka, if you'd like to turn your camera on and share your screen, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Kia ora, Kevin. Kia ora, everybody. I'm just about to share my screen like this. Okay. First of all, I'd like to begin like this. He honore, he korore ki runga, he maungarongo ki te matua te whenua, he whakaro pai titi ki titi pai mairere. Which is just a greeting in our language. Honor and glory above, peace on earth, goodwill to everyone, basically. So what I want to do in this talk is kind of break away from some of the talks that I've traditionally done and talk a little bit more personal. It's disappointing that I can't be where a lot of you people are right now, that I have to stay here in New Zealand. I'd much rather be attending this conference in person, but you know, this is the current world we live in at the moment. So what I want to do is share some of the thoughts, some of the aspirations that we have here in New Zealand, particularly with Māori and Māori language resources, just to kind of give some thinking around some of the issues that we are finding. So this talk is Indigenous Sovereignty of Language Data. I want to talk about language data in particular because that's the data I mostly work with. And I want to use the Māori example because, again, that's the data that I work with. This screenshot has a picture of an important institute to Māori. That institute is a wharenui. And so the wharenui is a meeting house where we come and gather. And it's based in a location and it serves to kind of ground us. So this particular wharenui is called Maruti Hiakina. It's based in central Waikato, which is the centre of the North Island in New Zealand, which is the centre of the world and the universe, as far as I'm concerned anyway. Okay, so there's a picture of the wharenui, and then there's two little boys there. One of them is my son and one of them is my nephew. And again, it's kind of symbolizing why we're doing the work that we're doing. And basically, it's not really for our own personal gain. It's for our children and our children's children and so on. So what I want to do is talk about some of the things that we've been doing, some general things, and then run into some specific examples. Okay, so first of all, there's not going to be many slides. Most of it's going to be talking. No specific reason, that's just how it's going to be. Okay, so let's see if I can get this working. So what are the fundamental issues? So the fundamental issue that we are having with our language data is that there's a big science community out now that, you know, it's doing good work, and it's doing good work based on open science that everybody can share. It's using big data to generate, you know, lots of resources, lots of initiatives, lots of progress, and it's able to use big data when that data is open. You know, and generally that's fine, but for Indigenous communities, we have a couple of issues. One of the issues is that there's getting to be lots of collections with lots of Indigenous information that the Indigenous people themselves aren't aware of. The collections that are being built aren't generally owned by Indigenous people, and Indigenous people don't really have a say on how they run, what's actually stored there. So we have some issues in general where our information is being made available that we don't have control of. And these issues are multiplying as more and more data is becoming available. Okay, so just a quick brief, what is Indigenous data? This slide is taken from the United States Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, which is a group of Indigenous people who are working at addressing some of the issues Indigenous people are having. And basically, they are saying that Indigenous data is data about resources and environments. It's data about individual Indigenous people, and it's data about groups of individuals. So there's three separate things that can define Indigenous data. Here in New Zealand, we've been looking at this issue quite a bit. We've organised a group called Te Manararonga, which is a Māori data sovereignty group. Last 5 years, almost for the last 10 years now, different people within these groups have been looking at the issue of Indigenous data sovereignty, and have come up with a kind of brief saying that it's data that we can use for governance, and then it's also the governance of our data. There has been other groups around the world that have looked at the issues of making data accessible. So there's a ground-up initiative that created the FAIR principles. I'm assuming that most people are aware of the FAIR principles, making data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, so that we can start basing some of our learning, some of our initiatives off. And then further on from those, there's a global Indigenous Data Alliance who have gotten together and said that we need to extend the FAIR principles of data. So they've created the CARE principles, making sure that data is available for collective benefit, being aware of who has authority to control that data, making sure we're using it for responsible reasons, for ethical reasons. So two sets of principles that are relating to our data. Within the Te Manararonga, we have our own principles that we relate to Māori data, and those are the principles of rangatiratanga, whakapapa, whanaungatanga, koteitanga, manakitanga, and kaichakitanga. So they're kind of aligned with the Global Indigenous Data Alliance principles, but more specific to how we see our data or the protection of our data here in New Zealand. In terms of Māori language data, there's an organisation that's done a lot of work called Te Hiku Media, and they've come up with a new license. They're calling it the Kaitiaki license. So this is an iwi-led organisation that's doing a lot of work with natural language processing. And the Kaitiaki license isn't about ownership of data, it's more about protection of data. In a similar way that we can't, well, in theory we can't, in a similar way from Indigenous perspectives, you can't own the land, you can only use it and protect it in the time that you're alive. The Kaitiaki license looks at data in the same way. It's not specifically out to own the Māori language data, it's more about how can we protect it, to make use of it for the best use, really. So those are a number of initiatives, worldwide initiatives that are addressing Indigenous language data. For me personally, I consider myself a Māori language activist. Activist as in a good guy, not like a bad guy. So actively trying to support my language. When I'm looking at data, when I'm trying to decide which data sets will be best available for which different purposes, I have a number of questions that I pose. And these are questions that I pose around to how can the data can be used. So basically there's 4 questions. Question number 1, whose data is it? So where is the data sourced from? Who does it belong to? When we consider Māori data, it's very rare that we look at it as Māori specifically. It's more common to look at the particular tribe that owns the data. So Māori society is quite a tribal society. So when we're looking at whose data is it, if it's Māori language data, then the question really is, which tribe does the data belong to? Okay, so if we've got some data and we're trying to build an initiative around it, then the next question is going to be, who receives benefit? In terms of who receives benefit, slides are not changing. It's still the presentation one. So is that true? My slides, because as far as I can tell, my slides are moving. Are the slides actually changing?
For me to echo and thing, but you're sharing your whole desktop rather than just the slideshow. If you're able to switch that.
Yeah, let me do that. So I'm going to unshare. And let's try and share it again.
Yeah. And most of us just
okay. Yeah, okay, let's try this.
Great. Thanks.
How's it?
That's it. That's great.
Okay. Cool. Sorry about that. Thanks for letting me know. Okay. So I explained a bunch of worldwide initiatives that look at Indigenous use of data. Now I've got some key questions that I ask myself whenever I'm using Māori language data in particular for any kind of benefit. So question number 1, whose data is it? Question number 2, who receives benefit from this particular initiative? Question number 3, who will have control over the data? And then question number 4, who receives financial gain? I want to answer these 4 questions with some examples. So example number 1. Let me just see if I can. So example number 1. So in 2003, 2004, 2005, a group of people worked with Microsoft to translate the interface of Microsoft Office, so Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Excel, whatever the other one is, and Microsoft Windows into Māori language, and the view that it would assist Māori medium schools if Windows and Office was in Māori language. This was quite a large task. This was like 120,000 different translations, maybe 600,000 strings. It took us a long time to do this while we were translating. So I was part of the team working with translating. While we were translating, someone raised the question, whose data is the translations? So we talked to Microsoft. Ultimately, the Microsoft owned the translations because they were paying for them. Some of us felt uncomfortable with that, but it wasn't like Microsoft owned the language. They just owned the translations. They made the translations available, and so we kind of thought that was okay, and we carried on. So to answer the four questions, whose data is it? So this is translated interface strings. Well, it was Māori language, but owned by Microsoft because they paid for it. Who received the benefit? All Māori language speakers who wanted to use Microsoft products in Te Reo Māori. So that was why we were doing it. Who had control? Ultimately, Microsoft had control over it. Who received financial gain? Microsoft made these products available for free, so you could argue that Microsoft didn't receive financial gain. Certainly, Māori didn't receive financial gain. Some of the translators at the time did. But yeah, so those are the four questions. That was example number one. Here is example number two. So example number two, in 2009, I went and worked at Google in the California office for 6 months. I worked on a tool called the Google Translator Toolkit. It was a translation tool to assist translators. And basically what we were trying to do was have a vision of the tool for Te Reo Māori. To make it work properly, we needed to create a corpus of Māori language translations and a corpus of Māori language text. So I spent a good 3 or 4 months searching out all of public available information. We fed it into the machine. We created the Google Translator Toolkit. It worked really well. It provided a lot of assistance to translators. But then in 2019, so 10 years later, Google decided that it wasn't going to support that particular tool anymore, so it switched it off. So answering the questions, actually, here is the data set I was able to gather to support the Google tool. So it's about 3.75 million words of text, 1.8 million words of translations, and 700,000 words in dictionaries. So I created this corpus. We were able to build the Google Translator Toolkit, and it also further down the track assisted with the translation, the automatic translation of Māori to other languages, which had good and bad things to it. To answer those 4 questions, whose data is it? Well, this was publicly available data, but I would argue that data belonged to Māori. Who received benefit? Translators of Māori language received benefit when they were able to use the Google Translator Toolkit. Who had control over it? Ultimately, Google had control. Who received financial gain? You could argue that Google, being an advertising company, received financial gain for that resource. Okay, example number 1, 2, 3. Example number 3. I took that data set, and one of my master's students used it to build this tool. So this tool is called the Macronizer. You can enter a sentence in Māori language, and it'll tell you which particular words, which particular vowels need to be lengthened. So one of the issues with Māori language is some vowels need to be lengthened and some vowels are shortened, and it's really confusing when you're learning the language, which ones are long and which ones are short. So we built this tool that if you're unsure, flick it to this tool and it will tell you. So this is the tool, the Māori Macron Restoration Service. We just built it just for a little bit of a try out. Turns out it gets used quite a lot, 300-400 hits a day. So it's quite a useful tool. Going back to my questions, so whose data is it that built this tool? Again, the data, I would say, belonged to Māori in general. It was publicly accessible Māori data. I certainly wouldn't think I owned it. Who receives benefit? Speakers of Māori language receive benefit from this tool whenever they want to check whether certain words should have the Macron character above the vowels. Who has control over it? So the tool currently is available through the University of Waikato, through the computer science department. That's where I work. If something was to happen to me and I was to leave work, the control would still stay with the computer science department. I'm not sure if that's a good thing, but it's working for us at the moment. Who receives financial benefit? Nobody really receives financial benefit. The computer science certainly doesn't. So it's a tool that's made available for free. And then the final example that I wanted to talk about is this tool called SwiftKey. So SwiftKey is just a keyboard. It's a keyboard for smartphones and tablets. What happened was that some of the people who built SwiftKey, one of them happened to be a New Zealander, and he said he'd like to have a Māori language keyboard. The benefit being that when you're typing in Māori language on your phone or on your tablet, it doesn't keep wanting to switch your Māori words into English. So they got in touch with me. I said, yes, this is a really cool idea. I made the corpus that I had available to them. They used it to build their model, and now we have a version of SwiftKey in Te Reo Māori. I actually think this tool is really great. It's great for a number of reasons. First reason is it doesn't, when I'm typing on my phone in Māori language, now I'm not being forced into the English language. The second thing is it's got a spell checker. I suck quite badly for spelling English and Māori, so it's got a spell checker, so it sorts out my spelling, including macrons. The third thing it does is it's got auto prediction. So if I'm typing sentences and I'm using the same kind of text in Māori or in English, then it will auto predict and it makes my typing faster. And then the fourth thing, it looks at part of the auto prediction is it looks at the typing that you're doing. And if you always say something in a particular way, or here in New Zealand, we have different dialects. So I'm always typing in a particular dialect, the Waikato dialect, the area that I'm from. And so rather than serve general Māori phrases or words, it's starting to serve me my own dialectual words. So it's a really helpful tool for encouraging Indigenous languages. Going back to my 4 questions, whose data is it that created this tool? Again, I created the data set myself, but it's certainly not my data. It belongs to all Māori as far as I am concerned. Second question, who receives benefits? So what happened was, this tool is available. It's a keyboard. It's a app. It's freely available. It doesn't cost anything. SwiftKey recently got bought out by Microsoft. So Microsoft owns the tool. I'm not sure if they receive any kind of benefit, but certainly typers of Māori language receive benefit. Who has control over it? Well, because SwiftKey was bought out by Microsoft, Microsoft has control. Who receives financial benefit? Well, at the moment, it's freely available. Maybe there's some ads happening in the background. I haven't really noticed any. I can't see anyone having financial benefit at the moment, but who knows how that could be in the future. So What I've done is I've looked at 4 questions and I've given 4 examples of where they could be used. So just to reiterate, starting to wear out now. This is quite, well, it's not really late for me, but this is in the evening for me. 4 questions about data sovereignty. So my plea is, if you're ever using data and you think there might be some kind of Indigenous tie to that data, then here's the 4 questions I think we should be asking. So question number 1, whose data is it? Who has rights to it? Who has inheritance to it? Question number 2, we're gonna take this data, we're going to use it to build a tool. So who receives benefit from the tool we're building? Question number 3, who has control over it? And I would argue that if it's Indigenous data, if it's Māori data, if it's Māori language data, then Māori people or Indigenous people should be the ones in control of it. Because only really they know the value and where it can be best used. And question number 4, who receives financial gain? And I think this is somewhere where Indigenous people, Māori people, haven't fared too well. We have a lot of data, a lot of our data is being shared, but it's very rare that the financial gain comes back to Māori or Indigenous people. And ultimately, we want to be players. The Microsofts, the Googles of the world are using data to create initiatives, but also to generate wealth. None of that wealth is coming back to Indigenous people. So ultimately, we need to keep asking this question and see how we can start generating financial gain to the people whose data it belongs to. Okay, so that's all I really wanted to talk about. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and maybe we can go for questions.
Thanks very much to Taka. If we were in a hall now, I'm sure we'd be hearing a round of applause. There's been lots of engagement, I think, and already a whole bunch of questions to deal with there. I'm going to pick the one that currently has got the most vote. They're all linked together, not surprisingly. So I think it's Angus who's asked, many researchers would love to ensure that the data they collect is only used for community benefit, as you describe. But some feel there's a tension here between policies around open research and open data, which may constrain our ability to do that. Do you feel there's a conflict sometimes between open practice and the sort of licenses you're talking about?
Definitely, yes.
Okay.
So really, open data conflicts with Indigenous control over Indigenous data. If there was an avenue where we could make Indigenous data protected in some kind of shell, and then people could query it, and the responses from the query could be returned, but the shell itself stayed with the Indigenous people, that would be the ultimate way to make it available. There's definitely a conflict, open data versus Indigenous control, and I'm kind of leaning, if the data really is Indigenous data, if the data specifically has Indigenous knowledge in it, then it shouldn't be open data. We should leave that data within Indigenous communities, but then what we should do is empower Indigenous communities to use that data in a way that's beneficial for themselves in the first instance, but then on-flowing to other community groups, other individuals. Okay, thanks. And another question, which, well, actually, I'm going to link a couple of them together.
So Joy has asked whether there have been any disputes over ownership of the data you talked about. And I wonder also, I was struck, you mentioned, I think in one of the examples, that there was a data set which, when you were asking that question about ownership, you said, well, you had constructed it, but you saw it as belonging to the people as a whole. And it may be that that's not been tested. I wonder here if sometimes, is it straightforward for you to, because I imagine the law, to the extent that it recognizes ownership, might simply say, well, no, it's you that owns this. I don't care what you think about that. Is it sometimes difficult to do that, as it were, the dedication of saying, well, the law thinks this, but I see it ethically differently?
Yeah, so there's some, I don't think the law has caught up to an Indigenous way of thinking. So as an Indigenous entity, we struggle with the law. We struggle with concepts of copyright and ownership, because, like, for example, copyright, if you make something publicly available after a certain time, copyright is exceeded, and then it's available, and then everybody can use it. But from an Indigenous perspective, if somebody creates something or writes something, explains something, makes something available, that should be held in perpetuity, forever and ever within that Indigenous group. And I haven't seen a law that is able to cover that. So there's strong conflicts between a Western kind of open data kind of copyright laws, and then the practices and thinking around Indigenous sovereignty, Indigenous knowledge, Indigenous data. And to be honest, we haven't sorted that out. We haven't found a solution that will suit both sides, and perhaps we won't. So really then it comes down to the individual or the group that's able to collect the data or able to gather the data, and their ethical behaviors or their own intuition, good kind of practices to see how they can protect the data, and make sure that whose data it comes from, those rights and those obligations are kind of met. But there is no easy answer. There is no answer at the moment. There is a mismatch, and we haven't specifically found a solution. The kind of closest thing we've found at the moment is the kaitiaki license, kaitiakitanga license, but then that's just about protection as opposed to copyright or ownership. So,
okay. And thanks for that. Another question, and they're coming in second fast here. I don't know, somebody wonders whether you have experience with other Indigenous language communities, and whether you think these issues that you've described are general, or whether they can vary depending on the setting.
So I don't personally have much experience with many other Indigenous language communities. Some of the issues that Māori language communities are grappling with can be reflected in other communities. Some of the gains that we've had for our language in terms of digital resources, or even some of our language support initiatives, other communities haven't had those opportunities yet. We're looking to share, especially with some of our Polynesian relations, some of our Pacific Island relations. We look at trying to share what we're doing, because we recognise that there is a important issue at the moment, and that many languages are under threat. And one of the ways to protect languages under threat, so the first way is to record what's happening now, and then the second way is to try and re-energize or revitalize the use of that language. And technology is a good way to do that. Digitizing things and making them available online is a good way to do that. But we've got to make sure that while we're doing that, we are being true to the data itself, the intent of the data, the Indigenous people. So we've got some things that we think are working good for our language, but we think we've still got a long way to go, and we are happy to share any of the initiatives that we've been doing. We're kind of all in this fight together, really.
Yeah. Although, as you said, it varies a lot with the communities, with some of the most threatened languages with handfuls of speakers left, and at least thankfully you're not. Although Māori may be under threat, it's not at that sort of stage. And I wanted to, have you had an engagement or experience with something I seem referred to called the Endangered Languages Archive? It's an initiative, I believe, funded by one of those trusts set up by the Rousings, the people who made all the money from those cardboard milk cartons, and particularly to try and attack some of the problems you described of capturing information about languages which are at risk of disappearing in the very near future. Because I know they've, I think, wrestled with some of the issues you've described.
So I haven't had much engagement really, because for me, our languages are, it's an endangered language, but we're trying to use it as much as we can. A lot of the work that endangered languages and a lot of other endangered languages trusts are looking at it's really about preserving as much as they can of content while we still have speakers. Because once those speakers go, so much information has been lost. So that hasn't really been my focus. My focus is really about, okay, well, we have a language. It's a threatened language because less and less of younger people are speaking it. How do we engage? How do we make it relevant? How do we bring it in today's society? How do we get our young people interested in all of the resources, all of the knowledge, all of the beauty that's in this kind of language? So that's kind of really been my focus. And I think as a language activist, you've really got to be a little bit selfish about your own language. It's difficult to solve all the issues of all the languages around the world, 8,000 odd languages. So really, as a language activist, you've got to be quite, I think, quite narrow-minded to, okay, what's your language? What are the issues? What needs to be done? And then just getting on and doing that kind of thing. One thing that I noticed when I went to Google, so traveled from Waikato in New Zealand, traveled over to California, Silicon Valley, spent 6 months over there. The thing that struck me the most when I was over there was no one really cares about Māori language over there. There's other languages that people care about, and then there's the Indigenous languages in California. No one really cares about Māori language over there. The people that care about Māori language are the people in New Zealand. So that's kind of like my advice. If you have a particular language, then that should be your focus. Try and sort out all of the issues, because different languages have different levels of endangerment. And yeah, certainly some of them, preservation or capturing as much as we can before it's lost is a high priority.
Absolutely, and I'm sure many people would sympathise with that. As you say, if you try and worry about all the world's problems, you risk solving none of them. And if you have one close to home that you can deal with, then dealing with that is good. And hopefully also your success can provide an example for others who you solve the problems indirectly. So I wonder if I can come to another question now, and again, feel free. This is one of the things you may or may not have experience with. Somebody has asked if do you see any parallels between issues around the restoration of physical artifacts, cultural artifacts? I know, for instance, at the moment there's considerable discussion in the UK and elsewhere in Europe around Benin bronzes, which during periods of English imperialism were stolen from the folks of West Africa, and previously certainly has been around artifacts which England appropriated from New Zealand. Do you think there's any connection between these issues, or is it just that they're all about cultural appropriation?
So yeah, cultural appropriation, that's kind of another thing. I think in terms of artifacts that have been taken, my kind of thinking is, well, I don't know if taken is the right word, maybe borrowed should be the right word. So if artifacts have been borrowed and they're being put into use that supports knowledge sharing of an Indigenous people, then that's, I kind of think that's okay. But if their borrowed time is spent or, is done, then maybe it's time for them to be returned. The artifacts that are from a certain area quite often, I don't know how to say this, quite often take with them senses and feelings and characteristics and almost like spirits with them. And there times come when you've got to move those things and put those things back. So I know a lot of the work that's happening with artifacts that Māori people are seeing overseas is to enter in negotiations, and if they've served their purpose, if they've been digitized and analyzed and all the information is finished about gaining them, well, maybe it's a time for them to come home. So I just want to excuse me, Keegan, I just want to ask, there's a couple of people asking about quote. So I just want to explain what that is. So part of the struggles that we have as Māori is colonization. So when colonization has occurred and continues to occur, it suppresses Indigenous people, and Indigenous people have to fight for the right for their knowledge to have grounding. So the whole concept of colonization, the big machine of colonization and the suppression of Indigenous people is something that's ongoing. And it's been said that data is the final colonization. There's a couple of people that work in New Zealand, and there's a bunch of people, and their research and their knowledge is about the stars and how we're guided by the stars and the moon. And their thinking is that the Gregorian calendar, the calendar that uses the sun rising and setting, isn't an Indigenous calendar. The Indigenous calendar is a moon calendar. So one guy in particular, his name is Dr. Rangi Mātāmua. So Dr. Rangi Mātāmua is a guy that's done a lot of work and has shared a lot of his knowledge about the traditional Māori calendar. And this is one of his quotes, time is the biggest colonizer. And I kind of think that's true. I think our concentration, our dedication, our putting so much importance on time frames, I think is detrimental. If we could release some of those constructs and free ourselves up, like one of the first things I tell people to do is when they go to a marae, traditional Māori meeting place, is to take your watch, take it off and throw it away, because the concept of that kind of time doesn't really happen, and things will happen when they're meant to happen. And we have a bunch of practices where it's all governed by time, and we've got to try and release that. Like I don't think we should get up at 7 o'clock every single morning, or go to bed at 7 o'clock we should get up when the sun comes up, and we should go to bed when the sun goes to bed. We should start conferences when everybody's ready, and we should finish conferences when all the talking is done. So that's what that quote is about. And it's just kind of, I like to have it behind me whenever I'm speaking, in case I'm late. Right? If I turn up to a conference late, or if I turn up to a meeting late, I'm just, I like to use, time is a bit of a colonizer. This is the best time I could be here. So that's kind of what that saying is about. And a big shout out to my good friend, Dr. Rangi Mātāmua, for sharing that quote with the world here.
Absolutely. And I don't know if you saw the reactions there, a lot of liking and agreement, I think, there with another of the points you're making there from the audience. So we've got about 10 minutes left. We may not be able to get through all the questions, but I hope I can pick up the ones that are getting the most votes. So one which I hope I've captured correctly. So this is about a question relating to the 4 principles you described, and in particular, as I took it, those questions that you pose about ownership and who benefits are ones in a sense that you ask the questions at a point in time, and you get the answers at that point in time. And the question relates to, have you encountered issues where something like ownership changes after you've answered the question about financial benefits? And I suppose the unwritten second part of that is, and does that change of ownership then potentially affect the answers to all those other questions?
So that's a really good point, and I think that's something that we need to be aware of. And like the 4th example I shared with the SwiftKey software, that data set was made available for this small company that was producing keyboards in multiple languages, so different language communities could easily type their language on their mobile devices. And then Microsoft came and bought that company, and now Microsoft has control of the SwiftKey keyboards. So there's sometimes that happens. I mean, you know, what can we do about it? It would be good if the SwiftKey company was still working independently. I don't know how they can financially gain anything from making apps available for no cost, and you know, unless there's advertising. Maybe by being bought out by Microsoft, it allowed them to do more community work. I'm not too sure. So it's a characteristic perhaps of what's happening, you know, in the world today. And all we, you know, from my perspective, all we can really do is try with our best intentions. There's no coincidence in the order of the questions. So the order of the questions, the first question, whose data is it? We have to ask that question, you know, where's the data come from? Who has responsibility? We have to ask that question first, because if we can find out who's the, well, I don't really like to say who it belongs to or who it has ownership, because Indigenous people have a different view of that. But if we can find out where is the data from, you know, who it's kind of come from, then the second question, who receives benefit, it should be that group, right? It should ultimately serve that group. If it doesn't serve that group, then we should seriously consider what we're doing with it. And then the third question, well, who has control? Well, the Indigenous group that owns the data and should be receiving benefit, ultimately they should have control. They should have sovereignty. They should be able to say it's okay to be used in this circumstance and it's not okay to be used in that circumstance. So that's why that's the third question. I mean, the thing that we are finding is lots of Māori data, well, not as much as English data, but there is Māori data available. Māori language data is available, but Māori aren't receiving any financial benefit from it. We're not being able to regenerate that data into our own people, to upskill our own people and build our own products. We still have to go to the larger international companies to generate products that can support our languages. So the fourth question is like, it's almost a dream kind of question. Mm-hmm. How can long-term down the track can we start repurposing any kind of funds that comes from this data back into the people who own the data in the first place? So, but there's never going to be, we're never going to always get it right. And we're, for me, it's just, we've got to try and do it with our best intentions. And here's 4 simple questions that can kind of guide us to our best intentions. And lots of times we're going to run into a wall or get run over by a bus or whatever. We just got to try and do our best, I think.
Absolutely. I think, as it's been put before, I think you're doing a great job there of not letting the best be the enemy of the good, and achieving a good outcome, even if it's not the perfect outcome, is still worth doing. And if I've understood you correctly, I think the other important thing there is that when you're answering that first question about ownership, it's not, you're not interpreting it in a strictly legal sense about something that can be bought and sold and traded. You perhaps rightful ownership, in a sense, you're considering it more from an ethical dimension, which also does have a legal dimension, of course, and that's important. So I'll just answer one very question now. Somebody's asked, will the slides be shared afterwards?
Yeah, I'm taking, of course.
Yeah,
of course. I'll flick them through. They haven't been shared earlier because I really only just put them together.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But yeah, typically
shared. Yes.
Yeah, with your agreement, we'll eventually link those to the program on the IDCC site. It will take some time necessary for us to do that, but it will. All that material will be available in the fullness of time. So, and sorry, just trying to pick up now the next question. So this is returning perhaps to this point about openness and the tension there between the principles of being open. Somebody's asking, do you think there's a tipping point where, in order to avoid potential issues of loss or threat to the language, that actually making material more open might be the way to achieve the aims that you describe about? I mean, is there a, again, it may be with the language with it, this is not an issue because those threats aren't there yet.
Well, there is a tension, really. Within traditional Māori society, some information certain tribal groups would not share with other tribal groups. Some information they would, some information they wouldn't, because, you know, information is power, knowledge is power. So with the open initiatives, open data, I think a lot of the data can be open, a lot of the data can be shared, but there will be some data that it can't. It should stay within certain community groups, and it's for those community groups to use it for their own particular benefit. But yeah, there's tensions. There's what things should we share, what things shouldn't we share. One of the important things that we have as Māori is genealogy records, because if you know genealogy records, you can work out, you know, which are senior and which aren't senior lines. And so each tribe has, you know, protectors of genealogy records. And so one would think people wouldn't share that, but then 100 years ago, a lot of our ancestors wrote a lot of this in books so that it could be shared. So it's a moving thing. So another thing that like languages change over time. They must change over time because the world changes over time. I think tikanga and customs must change over time too. So the rules that our ancestors strictly adhered to, they might be slightly different for our generation, for our children's generation, because the world is changing, things are changing. So we have to be flexible enough to allow change to happen, but we still just have to be conscious about protecting knowledge and protecting people's, you know, I guess ultimately that's what it's about, protecting ourselves. And again, the reason for the fourth question is keeping in mind when we're using data, how can profit from that data be returned to the data holders? Because that's something we're not seeing at the moment. That's something we've really got to address. Okay.
Thanks very much. I was hoping to get more questions now, but I can see we're running up to the end of our time, and despite what you just said, I'm unfortunately constrained. We are going to have to keep to our schedule for the moment. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much again to Taka. Thank you to all of you in the audience who turned up, who've engaged with your questions and with your chat. Let's continue in that spirit for the rest of today. We're putting our virtual hands together there. I don't know if you're able to join it. I know it's late for you to Taka, but if you're able to join to continue to answer questions in the coffee break that's coming up, I'm sure people would appreciate it, but if you don't, I'm sure we'll also understand. So thanks very much, everyone. There's an informal session now where you can join, as it were, for a virtual coffee break or whatever's appropriate to you at the time of day, and then we get into our first breakout sessions in 30 minutes. Thanks to everyone. Goodbye for the moment.